Welcome to the BEZA Performance Live Stream. At BEZA, we do executive disciplines for world-class orgs. And today we have S&OP Thursday, the second and fourth Thursday of every month, where I get to spend time with Doug Dedman, the president of DBM. Welcome, Doug.
Yeah, good to be here, Marshall. Thanks for the invite.
Yeah, today's kind of an exciting topic. We're going to get into it in a second regarding demand planning vis-a-vis S&OP, and they're not really the same thing, but they work together. But before we do that, let me show kind of our anchor concepts, the foundation that we think is a good S&OP process, which is that S&OP is the president's handle on the business. You run a manufacturing business with it. It establishes a clear link between your strategy and execution. It sets the flow rate and allows you to participate in the setting of the flow rate by family for the business. It establishes the clear accountabilities, mostly RNA, responsible, accountable, within the RACI model. And it sets up the repeatable, regular and repeatable management process for execution, as well as a measurable and actionable improvement process for S&OP itself. S&OP should get better while you get better at doing S&OP. So, Doug, it's an interesting topic, kind of daunting. So let me suggest that it's one of the more misunderstood elements, I think, of what I run into. I'll give you an example. Recently, I had a president I was talking to who told me all about their S&OP process. And I said, well, you don't really have an S&OP process. You have a demand planning process, and then you don't do anything about it. You just plan it and then kind of hope things happen. So that's obviously one of those things that kind of belies what's going on. There's a misunderstanding of what demand planning versus S&OP is. So let's just jump right in. What is the difference between demand planning and S&OP in your view?
Yeah, it's to pick up on what you said, it's a big topic, and I think I think we got about half an hour, so I'm not going to cover cover everything
Right.
that we can in a half an hour, and we'll probably end up kind of scratching the surface, and I'll
Sure.
probably say some things that people might need some to dig in, and I just would encourage people, if there's things I say that don't. Either you want some more detail on, reach out to Marshall or myself, and
Yeah.
it might be a good topic for a future conversation too. But
Sure.
yeah, going back to your question, it's what's the difference between demand planning and S&OP, and it's interesting because same thing. A lot of executives will come and they say, "Well, we got a problem with our S&OP process. And really, what we need to do is we need to fix the demand plan." And
Yeah.
that often, if we come at that from an operations perspective, we're saying, "Hey, I just want more detail. I want you should be able to do your demand planning at a more a discrete level, get down to the part numbers and a long enough horizon to cover my 36-week lead time, and I want to have that 100% accurate." There's more to the story than that, and I
Yeah.
think that question of the difference between demand planning and S&OP is a good place to start. And maybe, if you can, Marshall, just pull up the kind of standard diagram. And I mean, for anybody who's watching this, that's either familiar with APICS, or I guess as they're now called SCM, kind of the standard education, or any of that sort of stuff, and you put S&OP really in the context of all of the planning that you would do. I put this at the middle, right in between kind of that
Yeah.
strategic planning, demand planning down here, and the material planning that we would do in the master scheduling. And so if I think about kind of the major difference, it's helpful to think about this context, right? We have a strategic plan. That's that 5-year strategic plan. And we're updating that annually. Might be a little bit not as often as that. And S&OP, we've got that 12-month plan that we're looking at monthly, and then we really want that. And this is really the important part, is that we've got this 12-month rolling demand plan that ties into the S&OP process. And a couple important things to think about in this diagram. And first is that you've got this arrow going both ways, right? And
Hmm.
so you can think, a good way to start thinking about this is to think about our demand plan as however we're generating that demand plan, that the S&OP process should be providing sort of feedback or accountability to that demand planning process. And so we develop a demand plan, but we look at that
Hmm.
monthly from an S&OP perspective. And it goes back to that point of your previous, the diagram or the points you raised is the S&OP process needs to be measurable. So our demand
Hmm.
plan needs to be measurable as part of that. But at the same time, the S&OP process also needs to be needs the input from the demand plan.
Yeah.
So I've got to have that both ways. And so the two things have to be different. They've got to work together. But we've seen cases where if we integrate these too much and we say, well, our demand plan is just something that that we do, and it's really our S&OP process, we're really missing that feedback loop that's got to happen
Yeah.
between the two plans. And as we'll get into this in a little bit deeper in a bit more detail, the demand plan has a lot more to it than just the basic way that we think about generating a
Mhm.
forecast, if you will.
Well, so you just used two different terms, and I think it would be helpful to clear that up. What is the difference between a demand plan and a forecast? That's a very important distinction.
Yeah, and if I think about this, I'll break it back to this idea that if I use the word plan, right, it's got a specific meaning to it, right? A plan is something that we establish and we actually take steps to deliver, right?
Mhm.
We actually say, hey, we've got a plan to do this, and now to do that plan, we're going to do step one, step two, step three, step four. So it's
And
something
somebody
we're
can be accountable for the steps.
right. It's something we're working to have happen.
Yeah.
Whereas a forecast, right, is something that we actually, we think. Think is maybe not the right term, but if you understand what I mean,
Yeah.
think being it's something that we're predicting is going to happen. And so it's helpful to think of those two things as one can be very passive, right? I
Yeah.
generate a forecast, but the other one it drives to a real accurate, an active way to think about it. We're really comfortable when you have a conversation on sales and operations planning. People are really comfortable with the concept of an operations plan, a supply plan,
Right.
right? It's like, hey, what are you going to do? I want to hold you accountable
At least
to
for
a
the next month,
supply.
we know what we're gonna
Yeah,
do. Yeah.
right. At least for the next month. But I mean, but think about it, right?
Yeah.
We always say we're going to hold you accountable to that side of things. But do we do that same thing on the demand side, right? Do we put a
Yeah.
demand plan? So that to me is the first distinction in this idea between a demand plan and a forecast. But then I would say the second thing about that is that the forecast is really an input to the demand plan, if that makes sense,
Typically,
right?
yep.
So, like, if you think about it, I can generate a forecast in different ways. I mean, it can be a data-driven forecast, right? So, it could be an intrinsically data-driven forecast where I'm using
Yeah.
a
Statistics.
statistical forecast. I might even get overlay my seasonality. I'll be working on that side of things. Or, I might be more of an extrinsic forecast, right? So I might be taking whether it's like housing starts or whatever economic leading indicator that I want to put in and put that into my plan. We've got some people that we work with where they've got pretty complex models that they use from external. I might be looking at my particular market share. So all of those things are kind of important pieces that could drive into that. So that data driven piece is one way that I might forecast to go into my demand plan. The other one, and this is something we would typically see more in project types of businesses, right? So,
Yeah.
like if I look at it, if you're in an engineer to order, we use this method in our S&OP process at DBM because we deliver projects, right?
Right.
And so we'll have a sale. It's a pretty significant event that's going to drive some sort of longer term demand. And so in those cases, we would use something like out of a CRM tool, like, and by the way, I'm not promoting one over the other, but
Right.
Salesforce is one of the ones that we come across a lot, where
Yeah.
you've got opportunities in there. And that's got to be an important, that's got to be part of that data that we put, that we put in there. So those methods of forecasting, I've only gone through a couple of them, whether it's data driven, opportunity driven. You might also be using a method where you're integrating data directly from your customers, right? Those are inputs into developing the demand plan.
Right.
Um, now if we take a look at that demand plan and this idea coming back to accountability, um, for something to be for to hold something or someone accountable to a plan, what do we need? Well, the plan's got to be measurable, right? So I've got to have some way to measure it and some measuring it back to. I actually need to know who I'm going to hold accountable for the plan, right? So that specific accountability. And then the plan needs to be very specific,
Yeah.
right? So when we talk about it, well, what do we mean about the specific plan? And if you can, Marshall, if you can just maybe pull up my screen for a second, and when we think about the specific part of the demand plan, there's more than one portion of the plan that we look at, because demand really has three elements, right? Demand
Right.
has the bookings, which are the orders that we
Orders,
take, or the
sales.
orders. Yep, sales.
That's the S
Well,
in S&OP is the way
right,
we
and
think of it.
it's tough because one of the first things we'll ask sometimes when we're hey, what do sales mean to you? And you probably get different answer. Well, a sale
Yeah.
means the order coming in. The sale means the
Shipments
order, the shipments going out.
frequently.
So part of this specific piece is saying, okay, let's be real specific about the different parts of the demand plan. So for those that have been following this is that standard 5-section sheet, but I've got my bookings up here, which
Yeah.
is
Might be POs. I mean, it's a real transaction. It's not a
it's
forecast anymore.
right, right. And so I've got my bookings, which is my plan going, the order plan that I've got in there. I've got my shipping plan as
Yeah.
part of my demand plan. And then I've got my backlog plan, which is really, my age backlog. And when I'm looking at those plans, the specific part of that is I'm going to have some very specific accountabilities, right? So
Mhm.
I'm going to have sales responsible for the booking plan. I'm going to have the shipping plan, which is a real interesting one, right, Marshall? Like, if I think about it, I've got two elements to the shipping plan. I've got a constrained shipping plan and I've got an unconstrained shipping plan. And I'm going to have different accountabilities for those two plans,
I mean,
right?
the we might be able to argue, and I kind of said something I want to retract. The bookings isn't just POs, but the idea is it's things that you expect to turn into POs. That's the idea. It's
Right,
it's
right.
orders,
Yep,
not when the orders are delivered, is what I was trying to get at there. Whether or
yep,
not you use POs or not has nothing to do with it.
yep,
Um, and then I do think, just for the sake of explaining what people are seeing on the screen, it would be helpful to explain that the the current plan underneath shipments for the backlog,
yep,
uh, that is a calculated value. It says it on the screen, but that's a calculated by month, whereas the aged backlog is the current month, March in this case, backlog spread over which months that's going to get delivered in, based on the estimate of when we can produce it.
yep.
So that's what they're looking at on the screen.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that, because
Yes.
this is why that backlog is such an important part of the demand planning process. And I've had people argue with me from the sales side of the organization saying, "Well, I don't really care about my backlog." But you want to think about this, and this first example is a
You
really good.
should.
Yeah, you
It's
do
when
want
your
to
customers are getting their stuff, so you might
right.
want to tell
And
them.
and here's an organization, and they're relatively new. They're about 6 months into the process, and they're still working through some of the details.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about this is that, if you look at the total amount of the backlog, which is what, 21,000 units, right?
And which, by the way, if you sum the backlog spread, that's the same number.
Right,
Yeah.
right. So that 21,000 units, right, of backlog in my demand plan, right? Because it's part of my demand. It's what I have to deliver to my customers is actually spread out over this period of time. Well, it represents, and I can see this two ways. I could do a rough cut number and say, you know what, I'm shipping about 3,500 units a month. I've got 2,100 units in backlog, and so I'm
Excellent.
really, I'm looking at about a bit more than 4 months, closer to 5 months of open orders that I've got to worry about. Actually, closer to 6 months of open orders that I got to worry about, right? And so because, but if I look and if I look at that, it's actually spread out over this period of time. And so
Yeah.
when you start thinking about accountability in this example, if we mistakenly said sales is really going to be accountable for the shipping part of the demand plan, and we're not specific about it, we're actually doing a disservice in this
Yeah.
case because the whole front part of that planning horizon, and if you look at it, you can see it here. My backlog is equal to my shipping plan. My backlog by month is equal to my shipping plan in most months. There's a couple, little variations in here, but very close. My backlog is equal to my shipping plan as I go forward. And so what that says is I'm kind of sold out over that period of time, but who's now responsible for delivering the shipments in this
Operations.
case?
So the
It's
supply guys.
operations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what they're struggling with a little bit right now is, and we haven't adjusted it on this case, but you can see the bookings forecast for the first couple months, or the bookings plan in this case is showing zero, because they actually run their forecast off of the shipments and calculate the bookings that are needed for this. And what they haven't done in this case is they haven't updated the lead times, because if you think about it, if I'm going to, if I go all the way forward to this month here, where I've got 900 units in backlog and I've got 2,700 in my shipping plan,
Mm-hmm.
I need to book some orders, right, in order
Yeah.
to ship that out. And by the way, with the lead time that we have, those orders ideally should be booking in April. The way they've got their lead time set up, they're saying, hey, by the way, you can't you can't book anything, right?
Yeah, and
Because
when we say lead time there, we're talking about a constrained pipeline. We are not talking about the lead time for your supply chain. You could have a
right,
2-week lead time for your supply chain. This is the you're constrained somewhere. It may not be supply chain. It might be in, your production, but
right.
that's what we're talking about is and this is pretty common these days. We're running into people consistently with long lead times that they're modeling in their 5-section sheet S&OP like we're looking at. And this is where the understanding that you're emphasizing between basically the constrained shipment plan is the responsibility of both sales and operations coming together, which is why the executive needs to be interacting with the 5-section sheet at this level by
Yeah,
family. Now, you're not going to have 30 families, right? You're going to have 7 or 10 or something. But what I think is important to emphasize here is this isn't something you throw over the fence and then they come back and report to you what they're doing, because your lead times are probably in this case increasing, and you're going to have to make a decision on who gets served first and second and third, unless you're just using FIFO. So
yep,
not to jump all over your situation here, but I think the idea is you've got a pretty severe constraint, increasing lead times, and it's really operations that is the focus here. Um, I guess to get back to the question and regarding, and if I've derailed you, then just you derail me. But the question of the difference between forecasting and the demand plan, it seems to me that what we're saying is the forecast is an element of creating the demand plan, but the demand plan, essentially what we would call the bookings plan, is what do sales ultimately think they're going to sell. Now, the forecast might have a component of that, but they need to own it.
yep,
Ironically, most of the people we work with who have demand planners, the demand planners are primarily doing forecasts. They might be involved in helping roll up the sales folks, what the sales folks think they're going to sell into families, but the demand planners aren't responsible for the demand. The sales guys are. So
right.
ultimately, the VP of sales, if I were to be completely simplistic.
And
Somebody's
if
got
I,
to sign off on the bookings plan.
yeah, maybe just a correction on that. The demand
Okay.
planner might be responsible for coming up with that number, but the
Yes,
accountability needs to come
exactly.
back to the sales guy. And
Thank you.
actually, it'd be helpful. I'm just going to pull up one other example family
Okay.
before we jump into the next part of the topic. And I'm just going to. This is an example of a family where their decision and what the buffer they're using between demand and supply is that they've got the ability to flex the production up and down related to the way the demand looks like. And in this situation, kind of different than the other one where we saw an age backlog that spread all the way out here. If you look at this example, right, we've got an example where the first month is only partially filled by orders. So you think about this S&OP plan that we did
Hmm.
here at the beginning of the month said, hey, plan to ship out 22,000 units. We only have 16,000 in our backlog. And so when we think about demand planning now, the question is that 16,000 right or wrong, right? Is it the right
Yeah.
spot? And so often we'll have a feel for this in the business, and that but this is a real important part.
Sure.
If we're about 75%, in this case, the executive, when we sat in the S&OP meeting, he said, hey, if I've got about 75% of my backlog, of my shipment plan in my backlog, I'm
Right.
in good shape. Now the interesting thing, and this goes
Well, as long
to
as you sell the rest that needs shipped in
right,
that. Yeah.
right. So I've got some. So in this case, the accuracy of the booking plan is much more important than in the case where I've got the really really long lead time. And so when we're talking about measuring and holding accountable, the interplay between the shipping plan, the booking plan, and the actual backlog is pretty important. So, for example, if I just drill down for a second into the shipments, and you're going to see a lot of data on this screen, but I'll try and maybe hone you into what I want to pick at. If you look at the top here, I've got my total call, right, in terms of what I'm going to ship, and these are the different demand streams. And I'll talk about this in a minute, but the different
Hmm.
major customers.
Yeah.
And if you look at this customer here, the plan for the shipments is equal to their age backlog because the
Hmm.
lead time to that major customer is longer than 1 month. And so when I
Yeah.
think about accountability and specificity, I want to bring it back to okay, these major portions of my demand, and we don't do this for all customers,
Right.
but really the major ones. And where most of their book and ship lies is in the small customers. So they're planning on shipping 7,200 units, but they've only got just a bit over half of that already in the backlog. And
Is that
so
shipped
that,
from inventory? I can't
well,
remember
in
what it
this
looks like.
case, actually, they're able to build these
Okay.
units
Short lead
real
time.
quickly. Yeah, short lead time. And so that's a really important thing to understand when we go through this.
Yeah.
So hopefully that gives you a bit of a sense of maybe the broader piece of the demand planning
Yeah.
piece, and probably jumps into a bit of a little bit more of how the demand planning should work as part of S&OP.
So I always emphasize that this is as simple as it gets. Like you went to market this way. So for you to understand what's happening in your market and then react to it, you've got to model it at this level. No more detailed than this, but certainly not less detailed than this. If you just want a roll up of these numbers, you can't see the balanced plan. Now we're looking at real specific demand data here, but if you go back to the 5 section sheet, that's the view you got to see as the executive, because there's only one person that is over both sales and operations typically in a business.
Yep.
We do have some complex businesses where those two don't meet till you get to above like a group level. So then, you've got to have kind of a proxy person who's over this. But the idea is that somebody has to be accountable for the shipment plan, for authorizing the shipment plan, the constrained shipment plan. And that's usually the executive. So one of the roles of the executive is to authorize the shipment plan in our
Yep.
S&OP process. That's why you got to be in the executive S&OP meeting, because somebody's going to ask you, do you authorize this? Yes, let's go.
Right.
Make it so. Let's do
Yep.
it.
Yep.
Or you question it. Let's change it and then go do it. But
Yep.
um, that's a little far off from the question, but I think it's important because when we start talking about the difference between forecasting and uh, planning, at demand planning, we are talking about the accountability for execution, and that's where I think you went. So let's um, let's talk about, if I think we have just about 4 or 5 minutes left where we can talk about how should the demand plan work as part of SNOP, and maybe if you can summarize, and then we'll do a couple of more of these, maybe quite a few more of these, where we start talking about uh, elements of correct demand planning. We'll move out of SNOP and talk about demand planning because they're so important to each other in
Yeah.
the future. But for today, let's hit
Yeah, and
those.
I'll try to do this pretty quickly, but
Sure.
I think this is the important piece to think about, why there's a difference between that, how demand planning works as part of SNOP. And if I look at the crux of that,
Hmm.
it's this idea of you've got an unconstrained view and a constrained view. And you can kind of think about it if you look at this. I was going to say a diagram, but it's really just a simple schematic. If it's above the line, which is your customer, they really don't care,
Yep.
right? They really don't care what it takes for you to build or to get something to them. So they've got
Just get it to me.
just get it to me. I want it. I want what I want, and I want it when I want it, right? And
Yeah,
so
that's
this
why we
idea,
track request to delivery versus promise to delivery, right?
right?
Because you're acknowledging that there's a gap there potentially between what they expect and what you can do.
Right. And I would actually argue you need to do both of those, right? So
Yes.
request to delivery and promise to delivery, because request is the difference between unconstrained and the constrained view. But
Yes.
the promise is really about how are you managing the business, and managing the business. Most of that has to happen below the line,
Yeah.
right? Right on that side. And so just in real quick, and I won't go through all of this in a ton of detail, but if I look at it, and I think about how do we manage this in SNOP, the SNOP process needs to help me move through the unconstrained and constrained view. My family structure and how I look at the family and how I look at demand versus supply matters. And then really the data or the information that I use is pretty important, which goes
And the
back to,
presentation of that
and
data.
right. I know you're going to jump in on that.
Sorry. we I wanted him to change what the block said before we started, but he's sticking with his guns. So
I'm sticking with my story there that it's data. So, but if we think about the process, and this goes back to the
yeah.
accountability on the demand planning piece of it, is, and this is that standard process. We start at the unconstrained view in our SNOP demand, and that's where I can hold accountability to the sales side of the organization on developing that unconstrained view, which is really unconstrained bookings and shipments. Then I've got the operations team that's really got to look, they're working below the line. What can I actually produce? Right.
And
And then when
I
we
would
get
point out those are both processes that culminate in meetings where decisions are made.
correct.
Yeah.
Right. So those processes, and that's a good point, Marshall. I appreciate you saying that. These are really the pre-SNOP demand meeting, pre-SNOP operations meeting that happen on a monthly basis, which really is the culmination of all the other activities that you do up to those meetings.
Yeah.
But sorry, this is the point where you kind of do the reconciliation.
Yeah,
Um,
I can't, here's the unconstrained view. I can't do it. We're constrained.
and
So
what
here's what we recommend.
and how do we manage that? And then at the exec meeting, if we, it's what are the inputs on that? And that might be, well, we've got to increase capacity, right? Or here's the supply chain issues, or this is how we're going to do allocation, or how do we want to do allocation, right?
Yeah.
So all that's part of it, which really kind of dovetails into what level of granularity, or how do I look at the data to have this and to make this work. And just if there's time, just a real quick story
Here it is. Yeah.
on this. We think about this. First of all, we think about this. You've got to start at the constraint level, right? Because ultimately, if I can't build it, I can't sell it.
And I always say, when we say constraint, what we mean is kind of macro constraints, an entire value stream, maybe, or a line, or a plant, just depending on how you've defined the family. But it's not a theory of constraints. There's a machine somewhere, creating a bottleneck. I mean,
Right.
there might be, but that's not the point. The point
Right.
is,
So, yep. So think about that as, because going back to your
yeah,
comment before in terms of how many families you come to, right? Is if I've got 5 production lines, ideally, I want to be able to take the demand picture, the unconstrained picture at the top, and be able to bring it down to that constraint level,
Yeah.
right? And I want to look at that. And so this is important.
This is yeah, and this is the distinction that this is why I use DBM for all of our projects. This is a distinction in how to model your business that I think goes back to kind of what I call the laws of physics. Like that is what you do. You actually do have demand streams out there that can be modeled, and they culminate in they have a many to many relationship with these constraint based families, and the constraints are real. You have a manufacturing footprint based on how you want that to look, right? You've decided that you need some extra capacity in Europe, so you build a plant there. And so this idea of this is the way you do it, I think is fundamental, and it is a place that's I think unique with the way you think, Doug.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
to point that out.
and it's really, I mean, it is. It's fundamental to the way that we look at this. I've had, if for those that are watching that familiar with Tom Wallace, Tom and I had dinner. This is probably now 4 or 5 years ago,
Right.
and we had quite a rigorous discussion around this this whole topic, and part of that belief comes down to the fact that yes, I do need to view this in an unconstrained way as well, but ultimately, I need to bring that down so I can see, okay, what is the impact in my ability to produce it? And if I go back to the examples I showed you before, these demand streams, in the case that we looked at those large customers, they could have different demand characteristics, different lead times, right? So if you think about that all other one I showed you, well, the lead time is shorter, right? And how I manage that piece is different than the large customer where I've got a longer lead time. And so this
Yeah.
is an important way to segment and think about it. The examples I have here is a distributor, a large customer, or projects, which would even have a broader range of demand planning and forecasting methodologies that you use, but they've all got to come down to that constraint by the family. And
Well, and
so, oh,
I'll
go
even
ahead.
go back to saying that this is how I connected with you guys because we were doing lean extended value stream projects to increase capacity, shorten lead times, and we kept running into you every time we get invited in as a particular company. Actually, it's Emerson. Everybody, there's a lot of Emerson people watching today, so I'll just drop that. But so a lot of your process were developed at Emerson as well, but we would just run into them. I just kept running into DBM all the time, and I finally figured out what was going on. They would a business would implement S&OP using the DBM model. They would then see that the constraints were actually their problem in a season, maybe where they had extended, backlog that or longer lead times than they wanted, and they were looking for ways to increase capacity, and then we get hired.
Yeah,
So this view is the view that gives you that kind of clarity.
yeah,
As kind
yeah,
of a plug for how we do it. But
yeah.
yeah, I'm
And
I'm
then
pretty sorry. I
and
could go on
yeah,
all
just
day
to
about
jump, just to
sure.
tie it all off, and you've already seen this, right? Is that when we think about the final piece of that is on the 5 section sheet, is the 5 section sheet exists at the constraint level,
Hmm.
but then we could drill down, and we only showed the shipping view, but there's really the management of my bookings, my backlog into shipments by demand stream.
Right.
That's where, going back to the idea of accountability and being able to hold the proper people accountable for the plan, and then having the right methodology and the accuracy so we could get into tolerances and all those
Right.
kind of things. But that's all done at that level. So,
So the idea, I guess, in summary, is this critical dotted line between basically the people who don't care what your constraints are and you who has to care about your constraints is why we have an S&OP process. And
yeah,
so the flows as well as the modeling of the families and the data and its presentation all follow that. So I think
yeah.
it's brilliant personally, but um, that's not me trying to curry favor with Doug. I've known him a long time. There's plenty of things that I don't care
Well,
about.
I
Yeah,
appreciate
I'm
the
not always
brilliant.
complimentary.
I
So we have a
appreciate the
lot to talk
brilliant
about with
like that.
demand planning. I think in general. I mean, I'm kind of excited. This is
Yeah.
where we actually started the idea for these live streams around demand planning. And I think one of the topics I'll tease coming up next month will be the idea of accuracy because that's usually what I get. It's got to be more accurate in order to be better. And the point I think that we showed already, elaborate in on May 12th or 26th, is that a more accurate demand plan might not do anything because it's not your problem right now. You have
Right.
capacity constraint problems, and that doesn't mean you shouldn't go do it, but or that it may not impact you, but it just won't impact you the way you think. So, is it the right place to put all your improvement eggs? Is in getting better demand planning and forecasting?
Yeah.
Maybe
I,
not. Maybe you
I,
should put
I
more effort elsewhere.
I think if I had to summarize, because we kind of covered a fair amount of stuff. If I think to
Yeah,
summarize your first point, the point you just made is that S&OP's got to provide that context for the
yeah,
demand planning, right? It it should be the driver to improve the demand plan, but also the thing that tells you how much do I need to actually improve it by, right? I mean, it
yeah.
makes no sense if
Precisely.
I,
I know
if
exactly
I
how much.
Right. If I've got a buffer like this of inventory that I can manage, I might be able to have a demand plan that moves up and down within that buffer. Great.
Yeah,
But of course, every one of those buffers has a cost to it. So
right.
that's the important part. The other part is, forecasting is an important part of demand planning,
Yeah,
but it's a much bigger topic. And when we think about demand plans, so hopefully you saw that in here in the sense that we have to look at the, kind of that accountability and look at it at the right level. So looking at it in terms of shipments, backlog, and bookings, and that side of it. And then I know we just kind of touched on it at the end, but that whole idea that how you look at your S&OP families and the demand streams within the families is super critical, right? To
yeah,
actually get this to be meaningful and to work,
yeah.
right?
The picture we showed was way oversimplified, although there are simple ones, but I think maybe we'll show a real one, show people kind of a real demand stream into multiple families kind of model. So, all right, that'll be coming up in May then.
All
Promise.
right.
All
Looking
right.
forward to it.
Me too. Thanks, Doug. So, thanks again, Doug, for joining me on S&OP Thursday. The next ones are May 12th and 26th, where we look at demand planning some more, a little bit more in depth, as well as how it integrates with S&OP. Don't forget to like and subscribe so we can keep you connected. And don't hesitate to reach out to myself or to Doug with any questions. We're at BEZA Performance, B as in boy, E, Z as in zebra, A, performance.com. Until next time, thank you very much.